My name is Georgia Parsons. I'm a former employee, a docent, and volunteer with the Salvador Dalí Museum, and I've been involved with the Dalí Museum since 1989. I first got involved with the Dalí back in '89 because a friend of mine told me about a position in marketing at the museum, and my background had been in marketing, and I was looking for a job and always enjoyed being in the arts, so I decided to inquire about it. But one of my first thoughts was, oh, I'm not sure if I want to work at the Dalí Museum. I don't know if I actually like Salvador Dalí's work. But I went in and I interviewed for the position, got the position, and once I got in there and met the other employees and the docents and the volunteers, I was just hooked. This group of people were the most creative, intellectual, interesting people that I had encountered in this town, and I just felt like I had found a home. In the marketing department, we put on several special events, but one of my favorite was the Surrealist Masquerade Ball that we put on every year. And I want to tell you, the costume contest alone was worth the price of admission. I mean, people in the community loved this event. And in 1991, Wayne Atherholt and I decided to try to recreate the first ball that Dalí had put on back in the 40s when he and Gala were living in California. Back then, Dalí decided he wanted all kinds of animals involved with the event, so he sent someone to the San Francisco Zoo to bring down some wild animals for his event so we could have lions and tigers and things sitting around. So Wayne and I were trying to recreate that a little bit, and we had a lot of paper mache animals and things, but Wayne contacted Jungle Bob, who was somebody, local person who had wild animals, and Jungle Bob brought in a couple wild animals in cages that we had at the beginning of the entrance of the event when people came in, so we could at least have the wild animal effect. So the ball was going on, there were 500 people there, the band was playing, people were dancing. At some point in the middle of the evening, Wayne came running over to me and he said, "The python snake has escaped from his cage." I said, "What?" So we madly went flying through this place looking for this giant snake, trying not to alarm anyone or tell anybody what had happened. Finally, Jungle Bob found it. It was hiding somewhere, got it back in his cage, and everything was fine. But in the end, we decided that Salvador Dalí himself would have just loved all the confusion and the excitement, and it was a perfect tribute to Dalí's first ball that he put on 50 years prior to that. The museum sponsored a trip in 1994 to London, Barcelona, and Figueres, Spain, and it was a fabulous trip with a wonderful group of people. We had docents and employees and volunteers and a whole array of Dalí enthusiasts from all over the country. One of the couples that I met on that trip were an elderly couple from California, John Hench and his wife Lowry. And after further getting to know them, we found out that John Hench was an artist and illustrator with the Walt Disney Corporation, and in fact had collaborated with Salvador Dalí and Walt Disney on the short film Destino back in 1946. Now, the film was never completed in 1946, but it was completed a couple years ago, released, and in fact was nominated for an Academy Award. Later that year, after our trip, I received a Christmas card in the mail from John Hench and his wife Lowry, and on the front of this card was a drawing of a sculpture that stood in front of the Dalí Museum in Figueres that John Hench had done, and he signed it, and it is one of my most treasured possessions. Eleanor and Reynolds Morris were the donors of the collection, who were a couple from Ohio, started collecting Dalí's works back in the 40s and had the foresight to continue to collect Dalí's works for decades, became friends with Dalí and his wife Gala, traveled with them, so it was really a 40-year friendship. But they continued with one artist and wanted to keep the collection together, which was an incredible feat because their accountant at one point told them they needed to start selling the collection or donating it or something. But Mr. Morris was adamant on keeping the collection together. And we finally found a home for the collection here in St. Pete, and we're fortunate that we were the beneficiaries of that. The Morrises were very unassuming and unpretentious. You never would have known that they collected Dalí's works for all these years, and you know what they may have even paid for some of these works. But very involved with the museum, very caring. A funny story about my first encounter with Mr. Morris was the very first week that I was on my job in the marketing department. I hadn't met the Morrises. I really didn't know who they were. And this gentleman walked into the marketing office. I was sharing it with the marketing director, Wayne Atherholt. And marketing offices have things piled on the floor and brochures, and it's always kind of messy. This gentleman walked in blue jeans, a plaid shirt, a bolo tie, and said, "Bleepity bleep, you're knee-deep in paperwork in here. How do you ever get anything done?" And I just kind of stood back and thought, who is this man? And then Wayne spoke up and said, "Mr. Morris, I'd like to introduce you to Georgia Parsons, our new marketing associate." That was my first encounter with Mr. Morris. Now, Mrs. Morris, on the other hand, was completely different. She was very refined, very dignified, spoke several languages, but they were just so involved and so compassionate and so caring about the museum. It was just a treasure to have known them. Every visitor who comes to the Dalí Museum should realize that it's really one of a few museums that is dedicated to one artist, and it's also very important to go on a docent-led tour to really understand Dalí's works and know more about it. Some of his paintings are just difficult to interpret on your own. The friendships that I have made through the Dalí Museum have been just lifelong friendships, and ones that I cherish. Jonna Patterson worked at the museum when I worked there, and Jane Roberts and Charlotte Smith were in one of the early docent classes. And the four of us have just stuck together and remained friends, gotten together every year for our birthdays, for Christmas parties. And, you know, it's just inspirational to know people like that. The Morrises are so special to the museum volunteers because of their complete involvement in the museum, caring about everybody, wanting the museum to run smoothly, and it showed through with everyone. They always spoke to all the volunteers. They were just really, really special people.